In this video, I now turn to the illustrious, as Immanuel Kant used to refer to him, the illustrious John Locke, in his great work, An Essay Concerning Human Understanding. Comes out in December of 1689. Locke himself, 1632 to 1704. So the essay comes out later in his life. It is arguably his masterpiece. And it is what we could say as the founding or the first large-scale, well, it's fairly big, large-scale systematic treatment of epistemology from an empiricist point of view. And so it's going to be quite a contrast with Plato's understanding of episteme. As we saw, he never came to a complete sort of discussion of it or a complete definition of it, but it's in that vein, although Locke is going to take it in different directions. And Plato might say something like, well, Locke, what he's really doing is a more full-blooded, full-throated examination of a thesis. And we'll see how Locke does examine what comes in through the senses and what role in particular he assigns to reason. So as Plato thought of it as kind of like a power of the soul, Locke too will think of the soul as having powers. He will call them faculties. And that the soul comes into the world with these powers, but it doesn't come into the world with really anything more than these powers. We'll dig more into that. All right, so the title, An Essay Concerning Human Understanding, in the early days of its publication, so if you were to get a copy from 1689, and for several years afterwards, the title would have read An Essay Concerning Humane Understanding. Now, it's important to remember, you know, as words do, like most things in the universe, they change over time. The term human and humane were largely interchangeable in Locke's time. So if you do come across people talking about Locke and they use the term humane when they talk about understanding, don't think that they're talking about humane in the way we use the word humane today, which has certain kinds of moral connotations. You know, this is humane treatment versus that's inhumane. That distinction between human and humane wasn't really there in Locke's time. So that's a development. Those words went their separate ways a little later. So human, humane, same thing in Locke's case. Now, however, it's an essay concerning, and I'm going to go with the modern term, human understanding, which means it's about us. That is, it's about the understanding that we have. Are there other kinds of understandings? Yes. And we haven't really talked about what the understanding is, but the understanding for Locke is kind of like the collective powers of the soul, and that's what he wants to investigate. It's an essay, right, from the old French term meaning to try. So it's an effort to try and come to grips with what's going on in the understanding, what it is. But it's also important to note that for Locke, it's about our understanding, humans. So he's talking about us, not about God's understanding, because Locke was a religious guy, and we'll talk about his views on religion as we put our way through the essay. Comes up a lot. He was very concerned about religious tolerance and how people can rationally talk about religion. So Locke didn't have much time for things like fundamentalism, or as he would call it, enthusiasm. He thought that religion should be under a sort of a rational control, and he thought that God was a kind and gentle creator, such that he made us that we are able to come to understand him through our reason. So there's, you know, we'll see later on, Locke does talk about faith. So he's not going to talk about God's understanding or that of the angels. They too have a special place in the hierarchy of the different ways of they're the different understandings, and curiously enough, not beings on other planets. So Locke is we're talking about humans, not as we would say today, not non-human animals. And Locke says at the very beginning that the understanding, the human understanding, is what makes us unique. So in that sense, he's quite traditional. going back to the traditional definition of quote-unquote man as a rational animal. So that rational part that's grafted onto animal, that is the part that is that makes us us. All right, so we'll look at what he means by that, and before we dig into it, I want to talk a little bit about some of the background, because we are a long way away from Plato now. We're centuries, right? Plato, so we're now way up into the 1600s, and a lot has happened since Plato's time. Now, obviously, I can't go into much detail. So just a bit of stage setting is technology and science has changed a lot. The idea of science has changed a lot. The infusion of mathematics into science with Isaac Newton's Principia, that comes out just a few years before Locke's essay, that has an enormous impact. So science, if you like, natural science as they called it, or just science as we call it today, this highly mathematized theoretical view of nature, finding out the laws of nature and using mathematics as a language to express those laws, that did not exist in any serious way to speak of in Plato's day. That was the result of the scientific revolution at the time of Descartes. So this mathematization of nature is a background to Locke, and so nature runs on rules, and so does the mind. So we can start finding out the rules of the mind, namely how its powers, how its faculties work, and it's a good thing to investigate that. Why is it a good thing? Well, Locke wants to, in a sense, bring things a bit down to earth. And what do I mean by that? Well, let's have a brief look at Descartes. Descartes said something like this. If we look at things in the world, and he gives two examples that I just want to talk about. One is the famous wax example, and the other is the self. And it's a nice contrast with Locke. And it shows that Descartes has a rationalist view, and how John Locke, following Newton, has an empiricist view. Okay, what does that really mean? Well, Descartes, in his wax example and his self, wants to say something like this. For our deep-seated knowledge of the world, we have a special kind of vision. And I put vision in scare quotes, because it's not like regular vision with your eyes. It's not like a regular sense, as vision is part of the five senses. Rather, in his wax example, Descartes wants to separate the information from the senses. So yes, the senses do give us information about the wax, right? And the wax example is in his discussion in his work, The Meditations. So yeah, you get information about the world through your senses. There's no doubt there. But the deepest information that we get from the wax discussion is this special insight that we have. This ability of the mind to see into the essences or the fundamental structures of the world. And it's a non-sensorial. That's why I'll put insight. It's non-sensorial. Somehow the mind has this ability to see directly into the heart of nature. And this insight had ramifications for science, according to Descartes. So some of the fundamental propositions of science and ideas of science, Descartes thought we got through a special insight into the world. And the same applies to when we think about ourselves. That we have some special kind of insight into the nature of what ourselves are. And the parts of them and all that. So there's nothing, shall we say, that's excluded from the power of this special insight to see into nature, whether it be examples like the wax, external objects, or ourselves. So this rationalism turns on this notion that we have some special kind of power. So a special faculty or a special kind of insight into nature. This approach, though, this rationalist approach, is rejected by Isaac Newton and also by Locke in favor of an empiricist line, which really says, no. All you have are the senses, the information, the senses, plus your reason operating on. Reason, think of it for now as like these powers that the mind has. But it doesn't have a power to see directly into things. No, reason has to operate on the information from the senses. It cannot bypass the senses and get some deeper information that the senses can't bring it. Reason is more like a cut and paste kind of idea. It can take stuff from the senses and put it together in various ways. Now, why was this rejected is because largely Descartes, on this model of the understanding as having this deep insight as part of it, Descartes constructed what was called vortex mechanics. That was Descartes' physics, and it ran 30-ish, 40 years in the university, so it enjoyed its time. It was taught, but not too long after this was, shall we say, taught in the universities, and I'm speaking in fairly large generalities here, Newton comes along, and Newton's work, which does not have this kind of stuff like insight or any of that special stuff in it, comes along and more or less destroys the vortex mechanics of Descartes. And how does it do that? It's just way more powerful. Newton's system, his mathematical model of gravity, his mathematization of nature just turned out to be a far more powerful and successful, whatever term you like, explanatory system of the world than vortex mechanics. And so in that sense, the scientists just went, oh, well, we're sorry, Descartes, but we got a new thing on the block. It's Isaac Newton's theory, and we're going to go with that. And Newton was in many ways kind of like a rock star. He became very famous, very well respected, and was regarded as the author of this empiricist kind of model. You've got to be a little bit careful. Isaac Newton did have some of his own sort of rationalist approaches. But the basic idea that science was built on senses and reason, for the most part, that's Newton's model. But there are some other things in it which we have to go far too much into Newton to articulate. But Newton gets rid of Descartes, talks about senses and the reason. Locke picks up on that and goes, yeah, I'm going to do that now with the human understanding. So that's our background. One other point. In addition to, shall we call this, that's our scientific background, the move from science as conceived by Descartes to science as conceived by Newton, from rationalist to empiricist. We've also got to keep in mind that religion was deeply important to Locke, extremely important. So don't think that just because Locke is talking about the senses and reason and all that, that he's an atheist. Far from it. And don't think that he's not a Christian, right? Or maybe he's got some really different view or whatever. No, he's got a lot of Christianity and all that. So Locke was definitely part of the intellectual environment, which included, at that time, a lot of religion and was essentially coming down through Christianity. Now, what does that ultimately mean for us as we think about Locke? Well, with religion, Locke, the entire essay has a notion of religion in it. Locke, from time to time, will bring God in and his creative powers in when he talks about us. So Locke does not have a view of humans as evolving, right? So this is way before Darwin. This is, Locke essentially embraces that, yeah, we're created in the image of God. And what does that mean? Well, we'll look at a little bit at that later. But, you know, there were lots of things that God did that in making us that Locke presupposes in his arguments. And we'll look at that as we go along. So in many ways, God is sort of around the periphery of this discussion, and religious ideas are there. Also, Locke was very concerned with religious intolerance. And so what he wanted to do, for instance, when he wanted to get rid of notions innate ideas, as we'll look at in the next chapter, keep in mind of what Locke was really up to. He thought that if we did believe in humans having innate ideas, like you were born stamped with certain ideas, he thought that that was a kind of belief system that would lead to intolerance. And that once we realize that our beliefs and the things we know, knowledge is a construction out of experience, that has a nice side, a nice conclusion to that is, well, people will be able to talk about their experience. They'll be able to argue about it and discuss and come to rational agreements and, as importantly, rational disagreements. We will not have to go to war over ideas. We will talk about them. And if we are calm and we do use our senses and our reason, looks like we'll come to agreements. And maybe that will lessen violence and decrease war. So he had a large-scale view of philosophy being, shall we say, a mediator. It could increase the level of tolerance in society. Locke wasn't always perfectly tolerant of everything, and so he didn't always practice what he preached. Locke, has some problematic things in his background, some of his investments and whatnot, in terms of, involved in sugarcane operations and slavery. So there, Locke is no angel by any sense of the term. But that's a story for another day. But what I want to look at here now is Locke says that the understanding is an important thing for us to look at, because in a way it shows how we're kind of like God, right? We try to be like God. So religion, shall we say, forms a general background. So in that sense, Locke is concerned about religious tolerance, religious wars, and he brings in, as I mentioned, religious issues when he talks about the way we're made. So some of his explanations, we will see in a bit how this works to bring religion in. So Locke says that, without argument, the understanding is a noble part. So the understanding, right, and our understanding, and I'll try to keep it in capitals, our understanding. And from now on, if I don't put the our, note that I'm always meaning the understanding, us, not these others. So the understanding is this noble part of us, right? It's what makes us unique. Makes us unique in that we're above or better than or whatnot, however you want to express it, but it sets us apart from other sensible beings on the planet, and it is the source of our enhanced nobility. And for that reason alone, it merits examination. And again, it merits examination for questions of tolerance. But, Locke says, like the eye, like the ear, like our sense organs, the understanding operates kind of quietly in the background. We're more focused on what the understanding achieves rather than the operations of the understanding. Likewise, you notice more of what you see than how your eye actually works. So again, the products of the faculty of the power of seeing or the power of the mind, the products, visual objects, knowledge, those are always front and center for us, whereas the operations of these eyes and the mind, faculties, shall we say, are less known. They're more difficult to encounter. They're much more difficult to figure out how they work. So Locke says that this will be a pleasant experience to look at the operations of the mind, and it will be, as I've said, beneficial in a variety of ways. Achievement of peace sounds like a pretty good idea. And it will be beneficial the more we understand how our minds work, and he'll say a little bit more of this in a minute, but the more we understand how our minds work, the more at peace we will be. Now, what does he mean by that? Well, we'll have a look at that, but that has been an old refrain in the history of skepticism is, know the limits of the mind, and then you will be a happier person in general. So we'll take a look at that. That also has Stoic overtones as well. But we'll take a look at that a little bit more in detail later as we go through the essay. Now, so the goal is we're going to look at the understanding, we're going to look at its powers, its faculties. Those are there. Those we don't get from experience. You don't get faculties or powers from experience. Those are what's built into the mind. So how are we going to look? So what's our method for examining the understanding? Okay, with the big U, the understanding. What's the method for examining the understanding? Well, Locke says he's going to use the historical plain method. Locke has a tendency to write in very straightforward, sometimes rambling, admittedly, but largely straightforward ways. I'm just using a historical plain method. I'm going to try and tell a little narrative, a little story of how we come to the ideas and the views that we have. So the key idea is that everything is going to be, as much as Locke can do it, on the level of regular experience. So yeah, he's going to slip the religious stuff in, but by and large, he's trying to look at our everyday experience. So nothing fancy here. That's not going to mean, as I said, that everything takes place within experience and everyday experience. Locke will bring in God from quite often, and we'll look at that in more detail. So, but again, we don't have any, we don't have any special insight. All our faculties are powers of the mind, and again, we'll look at those a little later, are basically quite down-to-earth things, and they operate on senses. And we have the use of reason, which is like another power. But again, we'll take a more of a look at that in a second here. So this plain historic method has, shall we say, 3 parts. First off, what are the origins? So we want the origins. So the first thing he's going to look at are the origins of our ideas, and we'll define idea in a bit. So that's going to be a key term, so keep that in mind. Ideas is a very key term in Locke. It's also a very slippery term. He defines it. I'll give you his definition in a bit, and as we go along, we'll see that it's a little bit slippery, and people have said that it's either, you can take a hard line, say it's so slippery it's useless, or you can say, nah, it just needs to be, shall we say, reformed a bit or cleaned up a little bit. So he wants to inquire into the origins. So basically, what's the history of your idea? So if you have an idea about it, and just simply like you have an idea of a unicorn, how did you come to that idea? If you have an idea about God, how did you come to that idea? Tell me the story of your experience that led you to say, I have an idea of a unicorn, I have an idea of God. That's what Locke is saying. Okay, what's the story? How did you get that idea? And it's not going to be that I was born with it. He's going to argue against that. So in the context of your experience, how did you get the idea of unicorns, God, or the idea of a baseball bat or a coffee maker or whatever? All things come under this plain historic method, from everything from the more grandiose esoteric concepts to just plain everyday items in your life. So what he then wants to do is, once I can tell this story of how we come to ideas, he wants to then shift gears a little bit and show that knowledge is constructed out of those ideas. That knowledge is a construction. Well, if something's being constructed, there must be a power of construction and some kind of way of putting things together. So that's going to be like the powers of the mind are doing that, a construction out of ideas. So that's Locke's notion of knowledge. It's a construction out of ideas, and we still have to apply the plain historic method to the ideas themselves. Way down to earth compared to what we saw in the Theaetetus. Finally, he's going to talk more about God and religion. Because he's going to talk about things like the different notions or the different levels of knowledge. So knowledge will be largely a construction out of ideas. So keep in mind that knowledge is not just a species, it's like a genus. In other words, there's different kinds of knowledge. So in this sense, we've got knowledge as in scientific knowledge, but here we're going to be talking about religious knowledge. So there's quite a bit going on in this this historical plain method, but the key sort of takeaway from this is that Locke is going to always say, you have an idea or a principle or whatever you live by, how did you come to that? And you can't say, oh, it's just stamped on my brain when I was born, or I'm born with it, or whatever. He wants to put the brakes on that. He wants to say, no. How did you come through your, we might say today, how were you raised such that you believe that? Where does that come from? And again, it doesn't mean that, if you're feeling this, that the minute you say, well, you were raised to think that means that it's ultimately just, contextualized, or it's just relative or whatever. No, Locke is saying that we can come to believe through our experience deep truths about the universe, right? So don't make the inference that the minute Locke says something isn't innate or born, or you're not born with it, that something is frivolous or whatnot. Locke is not saying that at all. He's just saying that we should avoid looking for ideas as if they were stamped on the soul. And we have other ways of looking at them. So this understanding, Locke says, we're going to look at it, the analysis of the understanding, what are some of the benefits about it. He goes off on a long list. I've talked about a little bit them already. The analysis of the understanding is going to teach us its limits. So the understanding, of course, no surprise, God's understanding is going to be better than ours. So our understanding is going to we're going to see this. It's going to have its limits. So it's not like gods or angels. It might be better than other beings, but it has its limits. Now, what's so great about this discovery? If it has its limits, so what? Again, if you realize that your mind is limited, says Locke, you're not going to waste your time trying to thinking about things and understanding things that are very well beyond understanding. Why would you do that, right? That's a waste of your time. It'd be like a waste of your time when you understand how flight works, and then you won't sit around wasting your time trying to, flap your arms to fly. Same thing. Your body just can't do it. It's beyond its ability. So with the analogy is that, you understand your physical limitations and you live within those, and those can actually make you happier because you don't feel mad that you can't do that. That doesn't make any sense. You couldn't do it no matter what. Or if you can't understand certain things, well, that's because your understanding is limited. It doesn't mean that there's any problem with you. It's the very nature of your understanding has limits. So you can live happily within those. How do you know that? Well, let's say Locke sleeps. As I said, it's got a general background. How do we know that our understanding is, quote unquote, as Locke says, good enough? How do we know that? Locke says, relax. God's is a nice creator and benevolent and all these nice things. God set us up that our understanding, even though it may have its limits, it's not flawed. It just has limits. And it's not flawed because within its limits, you can live a good life. Know thyself, I guess we could say from Socrates, know thy understanding, and you will, because of God's goodwill, live a good life. It's going to be good enough, no problems. Our understanding is sufficient, Locke says, for a good human life, thanks God, and of physical comfort. So we're smart enough to transform the world. so that we can live comfortably? Well, there's a lot of evidence of we can do that. Unfortunately, it's not shared, that some people live in great comfort and some people live in, in terrible situations. That's a different question. Can we manipulate the world to live in great comfort? Yes, that's true. So that Locke would say, yeah, see, so that's a good example. And is our understanding sufficient enough for us to be good? And Locke says yes. So God has set us up so that shall we say, our understanding is sufficient for us to live comfortable, good lives and virtuous lives. So all is good in that sense, according to Locke. And going beyond that's just going to upset us, so don't do it. Use your mind in the right way. Do your epistemology in your Lockean right way. You will be happy. So there's an Aristotelian, shall we say, flavor to all this. Know thyself. You're going to live a better and happier life. And Locke even says, the light that God put in you is good enough. Don't curse it, right? If it's a candlelight and you can do your job, then do it. Don't get mad that you're not, infused with the bright light of the sun if you can do your work in candlelight. Better to light a candle than curse the darkness. That's probably something along those lines. So the first step is to provide an inventory of the understanding. What's in there, right? So what is it? What's in there? What's going on? That's what Locke wants to look at right away. And he says that the understanding, of course, it doesn't connect directly to the world. The understanding runs on what we've called ideas. Okay, so ideas, we haven't said exactly what they are yet, but ideas are in the mind. And Locke is sometimes a little bit difficult to, do they come into the mind? Do they originate? How does this work? We'll look at that in more detail as we go along. But think of it this way. The engine of the mind, with all its powers, are there, but its petrol, its fuel, is ideas. So Locke now, in section 8 of book 1, so if we go to section 8, Chapter 1, Section 8, Chapter 1. All right, so for ideas, go to Book 1, Chapter 1, Section 8. There, Locke gives us a definition of ideas. And again, he'll come back to this throughout the essay. But he says, what is the term idea? The reader will find this in the following work. It being that term, idea, which serves, I think, it serves best to stand for whatsoever is the object of the understanding when a man thinks. So whatever is the object of your understanding when you think, in any way that you're thinking, if you're thinking about canaries, or you're thinking about mathematics, you're thinking about, what you had for dinner yesterday. Whenever you're thinking, Locke says that's what's in front of your mind, what, sort of in that mind's eye, that's an example of an idea. So whatsoever is the object of the understanding when a man thinks. I have used it to express whatever is meant by phantasm, notion, species, or whatever it is which the mind can be employed about in thinking. So whenever you're thinking, your mind is running on ideas. And again, ideas, don't think of them as pictures. They don't have to be pictures. They can be all kinds of things, memories, propositions, abstract principles, numbers, you name it. It's a big, shall we say, ideas is like a great big grab bag. And where exactly do they come from? That's Locke's next step in his examination. So he says that everyone's going to agree with this. I'm not arguing this, right? So there's your first sort of statement. I'm not going to argue that that's how the mind works. I'm just presupposing it. Now, you could say, what's the evidence of this? You could dig into this. Locke doesn't. It's like, nope, we're starting here. The mind runs on ideas, and ideas are whatever is in front of the mind when it thinks. All right, Okay, so there we go. There's no argument. So the first question Locke says is, well, in our inventory, remember we've got the powers of the mind and we've got ideas in the mind. So the first thing he wants to look at, the first question in our, shall we say, in the taking of the inventory is, what's the source of our ideas? So you can think of the first big step is the presupposition that our mind has these faculties, whatever they are, these powers. The second presupposition is that it runs on ideas. And then the first step in the analysis, the explication of the understanding, this noble part of us that sets us aside from other sensible creatures, is what's the source of ideas? And that we'll look at in the next video. Stay tuned.